Last night, I dreamt I was a dog. I lived on a small family farm, somewhere on the American frontier, back in the time of plow mules and butter churns. It was one of those long dreams that feels like an entire lifetime. I remember the end of the dream with awful clarity, but the beginning seems like something that happened many years ago. The first images are vivid but disjointed. I recall the shape of my master walking against the sunlight overhead, the smell of his leather boots, the shadows at the edge of the forest, a little pig-tailed girl hugging me, fresh mud in the spring, warm floorboards in the winter. Everything had a peaceful storybook quality to it. Except one thing. Sometimes, late at night, I heard singing. It came from outside, out there in the far distance, from somewhere in the deep forest, beyond the boundaries of my world. Some nights it was one voice, but usually it was many, singing a strange, aching song. It sounded like a haunting cry. When I was little, I had whimpered and cried like this to my mother. But who was crying out there in the night? What kind of dark mother was listening? When I first heard the singing, I was filled with a blood dread. The hair on my back bristled, and I growled and barked at the darkness. Even after the night finally went silent, I trotted around for hours in vigilant anger. Later, as I heard it more often, I learned to accept it with a sullen unease. Of course, the singing was the sound of wolves howling, but I didn't know this in the dream. In the dream, I'd never seen a wolf in my life. One winter, I began to see them prowling in the woods. To me, they were ghost dogs, shadows sneaking between trees, eyes glinting in the twilight. I growled and barked at them, but didn't pursue. For several months, they never encroached on my world. They finally came on a late winter's evening. The sun had sunk into an orange glow beyond the edge of the world. The family was in the cabin, and I was out trotting through the snow, anxious to get back to them, because I knew food would be coming soon. Then, atop a small hill by the apple tree, an apparition. My body snapped to attention, and I growled, the hairs on my back standing on end. It was a wolf, just a stone's throw away from me. Its silvery coat, half lit in the dying light of day. It came toward me in a sleek, soundless jaunt. I barked and snapped at the air. It slowed and stopped just beyond my lunging distance. Now, crazed with fear and anger, I saw that it was a large female, healthy, well-fed, with a gorgeous coat. Misty gray, the color of snow, seen at a winter's distance. Its smell was alien, confusing, but laced with a clear and potent confidence, a supreme assuredness. Indeed, it did not seem to be afraid of me at all, nor did it threaten. Its mouth hung slack, and steam issued from its muzzle in steady, happy puffs. This calmed me for a moment, and in the next moment redoubled my anger. I growled from the deepest, most murderous part of my dog's self. It spoke to me. Its mouth didn't move, and there was no sound, but by the logic of the dream, it spoke to me in a clear, dignified voice. "Hello, child," I snarled at it. It took another step forward, and its eyes caught the last of the sunlight, glowing in a fantastic array of yellows. Those eyes, rimmed in jet black like mascara, projected a powerful allure, an otherworldly glamour. You bark and snarl, but look at my face. Am I not your kind? It asked. I could not answer. I could only growl softly. Is my face not like your mother's? Do you remember hers? A sudden scent of distant memory came to me, and I felt a pang of loneliness. I had not seen my mother or any other dogs since I was small. Since I had come to the farm, my only family had been the people I lived with, and a few of the more tolerant pigs. I searched now for dim, fragrant memories of my mother. I felt her huge, bristled muzzle licking at my face. I saw her giant, sweeping legs as I followed them through the high fields. She had seemed taller than a horse then. I remember the softness of her teats, feeding from them with my brothers and sisters. What had become of my family? I had spent every day with them, and then one day, all gone. The wolf paced back and forth now, keeping a small distance from me, its eyes ranging over the farm. Again, I saw some strange, haunting glamour in them, something that glittered with secret, distant power. The people in that house, they're not your family. We are. We share ancient blood, it said, its voice deep and resounding with the rhythm of wisdom. My master had a voice like this, but it didn't have the total authority of this alpha female's. I saw with alarm 2 dark shapes come over the hill by the apple tree. More wolves, moving silent with heads lowered. I barked at them. You hate us and love them, but do they love you? What are you to them? Aren't you the lowest of the low? Always getting the last of the food, the smallest scraps. Imagine living differently. Imagine taking your own food, killing, drinking lifeblood, being master over others. The 2 other wolves slunk down the hill. The skin on my back tightened again, but the strange hypnotic power of the alpha wolf held me still. You could leave this house and come with us. We range the forest. We've seen rivers wider than this whole valley, mountains that go up into the clouds, lakes with no end but the end of the world, places with no houses or men at all. You could be with us. We could be your brothers and sisters. The other 2 wolves came closer. They were unmistakably female, both young and well-muscled. Their confidence was not as absolute as the alpha wolves, but they showed no fear as they came to me. I smelled on them a strange longing, a deep winter's desire for warmth. The alpha wolf stepped closer, close enough that her steaming breath tickled my nose. Her eyes danced with cold, burning light, and she spoke in a voice that made my blood hum. Outside, your life waits everything you've never known, she said. There are worlds, child. There are ecstasies. Then I recognized the allure that lit her eyes, the unspeakable longing that glimmered in their depths. It had seemed this whole time to be some fantastic alien desire, reaching out to me from a distant world. Perhaps it truly was. but more simply than this. It was hunger. Plain hunger. That ancient, unsleeping hunger, older than the first furred thing that ever gave rise to the races of dogs and wolves and men. Hunger had brought this wolf across rivers and mountains and endless frozen plains to meet me in that moment. I can still see her face, the final image of the dream before the other wolves tore into me, and I died and I awoke. Her face with eyes that spoke of open loneliness. Her face, so noble and gentle and motherly. Her face, as beautiful and ancient as the stars. What do you do when a child who bleeds and sweats and pees LSD suddenly goes missing? Well, conduct a massive search. As massive as we could manage. Almost every mentally elevated CIA department was involved. We didn't trust anybody else. We never trusted anybody else. Shit, we didn't even trust ourselves, considering that it was one of our own who had taken the child. We searched for about 2 months, but never really turned up any leads, since every other returned child had died within a few days of being freed from their anemotic sac. We scaled the search down pretty quickly. It's one thing to search for somebody like Bin Laden, when everybody knows you're looking for him. It's another thing to search for somebody you would just work quite hard to erase from official existence, so you would be free to perform tests on her. We felt that the search itself was more of a security risk than the missing child, since she was almost certainly dead. There was also a feeling that maybe it was for the best. Maybe she would survive. Maybe she would have a happy life. Maybe it was best not to know her fate. But then, about 7 years later, we learned what happened. If you'll allow me to wax philosophical for a moment, I'd like to quote a poem from Aeschylus that I've actually never read. Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. While I'm no literary scholar, I believe this means learning can hurt sometimes. So, she had survived. Her genes came up in our program to collect a global genetic snapshot. A total boondoggle, by the way. So where was she? Being worshipped as a god by some doomsday cult like Johnny 2? Floating through space in a bubble to Jupiter and beyond. Estonia. She was found in Estonia, in a Swedish-speaking village on the island of Hiiumaa. She was living a normal life. Apparently, the issue with the bio-LSD had resolved itself after detachment from the placenta. Otherwise, anybody who got a kiss from her would have found themselves going on a very strange journey. She was about 13 years old at this point, and had survived travel far longer than any other child. This meant she was an asset we absolutely had to obtain. She contained the secret to survivable travel, something that had eluded us for years. It would have been convenient if she was living a life of abuse and drudgery in some orphanage somewhere. We could have simply considered her a victim of fortune. But she was actually living in some quaint little village on the edge of a forest with an old couple who had been given some phony story by our former agent. It was a nice life. Quiet. Maybe a little boring. But a nice one. We took her in the middle of the night back to our facility in Colorado. In the end, she wasn't a victim of fortune. She was a victim of us. That's interesting. When I was working for the CIA, we found that animals could often survive travel through the flesh interfaces much better than humans could. We regularly had success sending dogs and cats through. Somebody hit upon the idea of sending some hill minya, a type of bird, through the interface because they are adept at imitating sounds. This was the next best thing to sending a tape recorder. The interfaces did not accept non-living objects. We worked on grafting a tape recorder to a turtle, but this was unsuccessful on several levels. We sent the birds through, and they returned unencased but covered with the typical fluids. Those of us who subscribed to the alien theory had high hopes that they would record alien speech. Instead, or indeed, they came back imitating a strange flute-like speech music. The music was quite interesting, though having all the birds sing at once created distinctly unpleasant effects. Somebody in the department ended up killing all the birds, though we never found out who. After the orbital arrays incinerated the city, they dropped our platoon in to take a look around. We had seen it before. An endless graveyard. Everything. Ashes. Ash buildings. Ash people. For 6 days we trudged through the dead city before finding the first sign of life. On the edge of the blast zone, before frozen winter fields, a small flowering bush. Perhaps the heat of the bombardment had tricked it into blooming early. We all looked at it for a silent moment and quickly moved on. We were young and tired, just miles from the rendezvous. Yet sometimes at night, that silent moment returns, and I see them fluttering again in the cold, uncaring wind. Doomed flowers, soft and pale. I'm not sure who came up with the idea of sending a dead body through the portal. It's such a simple idea, and yet, at the time, it made no more sense than buckling a dead body into a space capsule and sending it up into space. We wanted to find out what was on the other side of the portal, beyond the event horizon. We had been studying the so-called flesh interfaces for years, and all of the mysteries that surrounded them. The portal phenomenon, the apparent teleportation of objects which occurred within the fleshy tunnel, was the greatest mystery of all. So, sending a dead body made little sense. Remember, this is what we knew at the time. If an inanimate object went through the portal, it returned a short time, 3 seconds or so later, at a random location within the interior zone. Cameras and sensors picked up nothing of interest. If an animal went into the portal, it sometimes returned, either alive or dead. Most returned altered. If an adult human went into the portal, the person was likely to return, but would either be dead or too altered to describe the other side. Those who returned alive died shortly after. If a child went into the portal, the child was likely to return alive, but was invariably altered. However, the altering was relatively mild, and some even remained cognizant. Unfortunately, information gleaned from them was cryptic and seemed to generate more questions than answers. They all died shortly after. Sending children through the portal was distasteful to us for obvious reasons, and we were searching for an alternative. One day, during an experiment, someone was about to send a group of genetically altered mice through when they noticed that one of the mice was dead. Perhaps out of curiosity, they sent it with the other ones anyway. All the mice came back alive. This was obviously of great interest. Now we were not only dealing with teleportation, but with resurrection. Of course, we immediately started sending all manner of dead animals through the portal. We joke that if the portal was actually some kind of alien office mailing tube, they'd probably be pretty pissed about all the dead rodents. Most of the animals were rejected in the manner of inanimate objects, but occasionally, if they were quite freshly dead, they would come back alive. Not only that, but none of the returned animals seemed altered at all. This was exciting. Naturally, we progressed to people. We wanted very fresh, very intact corpses. So, we had to face the question of how to kill a person with the least harm, as the official recommendations absurdly phrased it. We settled on a method of stopping the heart with electricity. Very neat. The first 16 subjects were rejected by the portal. We felt pretty low. In our attempts at resurrection, we were racking up quite a body count. Finally, the 17th subject came back to us. Not only that, but he was cognizant and seemed entirely unaltered. Now, finally, after decades, we were about to find out the secret of the other side. In 63 BC, the Roman general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus marched his soldiers across the kingdom of Judea and laid siege to Jerusalem, its heavily fortified capital city. Known to history as Pompey the Great, he was 43 years old at the time and one of the most powerful men in the world, an ascendant general tasked with expanding the mightiest empire on earth. In his dealings with the occupants of the obscure kingdom of Judea, he surely had become aware of their peculiar devotion to a mysterious god which they worshipped to the exclusion of all others, a strange notion for a cosmopolitan Roman, accustomed to a bustling marketplace of competing gods and cults. He also knew that at the heart of Jerusalem there stood a great temple, even more well fortified than the rest of the city, where his curious god resided amongst angelic statues of gold and other symbols of occult majesty. This temple was the holiest site in a holy kingdom and contained within its walls a small sanctuary chamber known as the Kodesh HaKodashim, or Holy of Holies, where the very presence of this god was said to dwell in darkness. Nobody in the kingdom was allowed in the Kodesh HaKodashim except the high priest, and then only once a year on the Day of Atonement to sprinkle animal blood on the ground as an offering. The Kodesh was separated from the rest of the temple by an elaborate curtain, and the high priest was required to ritually cleanse himself before entering. It was said that any unclean person who entered the Kodesh would be met with death, and legend has it that the high priest only entered the sanctuary with a rope tied around his ankle so that if he died therein, he could be pulled back out. How much of this did Pompey the Great know on the day the city finally fell after a 3-month siege? On that day, he and his soldiers slaughtered 12,000 Jews who were defending the sanctuary, and he strode through the entrance of the imposing temple as a conquering hero to the Romans and a murdering intruder to the Jews. Inside the temple, he saw the glittering wealth acquired from faithful Jews throughout the region. But rather than wealth, it seemed that he was more interested in finally laying eyes on the reclusive god he had heard so much about. Ancient historians record that he did not relieve the temple of its treasure, but instead went to the Kodesh. Maybe he wanted to see what sort of magical creature could maintain such a peculiar hold over its faithful that they would not abandon the temple even after it was hopelessly overrun, that they would stay and die by the thousands, sacrificing their own blood on its grounds. Perhaps he was unaware of the tales of death that surrounded the Kodesh HaKodashim. Perhaps he didn't know that this was a god which had leveled the world with a flood, which had rained fire on cities, which had delivered the Jews from the yoke of the mighty Egyptian empire, which had destroyed armies and kingdoms. Or perhaps he had heard these stories and simply didn't believe them. At any rate, history records that he went to the inner part of the temple and pulled back the curtain, which hid the Kodesh from the world so that he might stand and gaze upon the very presence of God. The man was an illegal immigrant from Honduras. Illegal immigration had always been a great help to us. Why bother to erase people when they can do it themselves? Anyways, he was under the impression that he had been in the custody of immigration enforcement for the last few months, while we ran the standard battery of tests. He was 24 years old, 171 centimeters tall, above average intelligence. We stopped his heart with electrodes and put him inside the flesh interface. He came back quite jittery and minimally responsive. Posing as doctors and nurses, our technicians took him to a medical room for testing and interviews. We assumed he had been altered, but we tested his blood for the presence of the exotic LSD analogs that accompanied alteration, and there were none. Slowly, over a period of several hours, he began to calm down. Then, he began to talk. We asked him what he remembered about the last few hours. He was under the impression that his experiences had merely been a dream, that some sort of calamity had happened during his sleep which left him reeling. He assumed that the part where we dragged him out of bed and stopped his heart was a dream too. He said that after that part of the dream, he suddenly found himself inside something that looked like a giant sausage casing, like a tunnel of meat. This was very exciting to us, because it roughly corresponded to the appearance of the flesh interface, which contained the portal. But given how he was brought into the interface tunnel dead and returned within the interior zone, he couldn't possibly have seen the interface tunnel. Therefore, we surmised he was describing the interface on the other side of the portal. This was our first concrete knowledge of what was on the other side. What did Pompey expect to find on the other side of the curtain? In many Roman temples, there was an image of the honored god occupying some central place in the structure. It can be assumed that he expected to find one of these. But did he expect to find the actual presence of God? Could he have possibly expected this? For if he had believed in the Jewish lore, wouldn't he have also expected death? Wouldn't he expect to be punished for defiling the temple? Would he have been so cavalier about pulling back the curtain? Perhaps in his polytheistic mindset, he assumed that his gods, which had seen fit to give him yet another glorious victory, were more powerful than this backwater Jewish god. What did we expect to be on the other side of the portal? Some kind of intelligence which could explain the bizarre living conditions of the flesh interfaces. If the interfaces were the product of an intelligence, was it really something we wanted to make contact with? Did we expect this intelligence to be kind and benevolent? If so, what would a benevolent intelligence possibly make of our ruthlessness, a rapacious quest for understanding? According to Tacitus, the ancient historian, when Pompey pulled back the curtain and gazed upon the Kodesh Hakodashim, it contained no representation of the deity. The sanctuary was empty, and the Holy of Holies untenanted. He found nothing, an empty room, nor was he met with death. Instead, he strode out of the temple, alive and healthy, destined to go on to the greater and greater political glory, until 15 years later when he was finally stabbed to death on the shores of the Nile Delta, after his defeat to Julius Caesar in the Roman Civil War. As the man spoke of walking through the unearthly, living tunnel of the flesh interface, he said he saw a bluish light ahead and heard what seemed to be music, almost like flutes but much, much deeper. As he told his story, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed, wearing a loose gown, his hand wandered to his chest, and he touched the skin above his heart. There, he found 2 slightly singed patches of skin where we had attached the electrodes that ended his life. I still get chills when I recall how his face changed when he realized that it had not been a dream at all. It was a pitiful, almost childish look of terrible, unwanted understanding. Tears quickly flooded his eyes. This man, who had been brought back from death itself by an unimaginable technology, by forces beyond all our understanding, slowly went limp and died for a second time. And so we were left with disappointment once again. More mystery, more frustration. We had already heard from our child subjects about the strange flute music, but always in cryptic, disjointed terms. We had hoped that this man would give us something more concrete, but the answer had eluded us once again. So, we went back to our experiments, selecting a new round of subjects to send through the portal. We had already sacrificed so many lives in our quest, and there was no reason to stop then. Knowing what I know now, I sometimes wonder, was Pompey lucky when he pulled back the curtain and found nothing? Of all the children who had been returned from the portals, only one survived in the long term, though we didn't even realize it until years later. She had been stolen or rescued from us by a rogue technician shortly after return, and was thus lost to us for many years. We finally found her in Estonia and kidnapped her from her adoptive family in the middle of the night. She was 7 when we lost her, and 13 when we found her again. We did a preliminary interview, and she seemed normal in every respect. Mind you, this was a girl who entered a massive, possibly alien, biological device called a flesh interface, disappeared from existence for several minutes, then returned, encased in an amniotic sac attached to a placenta via umbilical cord, with enough LSD in her bloodstream to turn all of Utah into one massive orgy. Naturally, we expected some sort of mental changes, especially since every child who returned from the portals had shown signs of mental aberration. Then again, every other child had died shortly after return, so she was clearly something special. But no, she was normal. Frustratingly normal. So, we started prying into her past. She was reticent, but young and fairly trusting, and it wasn't hard to get information out of her. She said she was born in Brazil, which was correct. We had acquired her from a Brazilian orphanage where she had lived since infancy, the daughter of a dead prostitute and an unknown father. She vaguely remembered her time at the orphanage, and they were not very happy memories. She then began telling us about the first day she met her adoptive parents, but we wanted to know about the time in between, when she was in our possession, when she went into the portal and came back. We asked what happened before she met her adoptive parents. She said she remembered a long, boring boat trip to come over to the Estonian islands. We asked her where she lived before then. At this question, she grew distinctly uncomfortable. She said she didn't really remember. We pressed her. Her face began to twitch and shudder. This was the first time she had showed any sign of abnormality. We kept pressing her on the question. There was one summer, she said, quietly, after I moved out of the orphanage, but before I came to Estonia, when I lived with a woman who said she was my mother, This was news to us. Our files had it that she had lived continuously at the orphanage. We asked her about the exact time, but all she knew was that it was for one summer. This was curious, because she had been in our possession one summer 7 years ago. The timelines matched well, but the events were entirely different. We asked her to elaborate. She said that one day a woman had come back to the orphanage, saying that she was her mother, and the Americans who ran the place had made her go with the woman. They had gone to a crummy old house, and she lived there for a summer. As she said this, she began to sob. She said that she had forgotten all about this, that she hardly remembered it at all, that she didn't want to talk about it. She wasn't my mother, I knew. Her face wasn't right. It wasn't a real face. Oh no, this one is real. This is always the first thought when waking up after a blackout. After hours of flighting between different varieties of nightmare, you start to dream that you're lying sick and insane in a stained bed in a shithole apartment that smells like cigarettes and spoiled ham. Your slowly crystallizing consciousness begins to note that this particular nightmare is more persistent than the others, but it has a certain uncanny clarity to it. Oh no, you realize this one is real. You wake up to the utter ugliness of your reality. It's too much, too awful. What is the last thing you remember? God, it wasn't even midnight before the madness set in. You look at your hands. A tiny vibration runs through the fingers. Your entire mind feels like the raw, meaty patch that is left after a fingernail is torn off. How many hours were you blacked out? 3? 4? You sit up and look around for evidence of mischief. Smashed plates, bags of takeout food, a nightstand drawer filled with vomit. All clear. You feel your face for bruises. Nothing major. Wallet and phone, present and accounted for. Your phone says it's 2 p.m. Not bad. You check the calls and text. Nothing unusual. No 2-hour conversation with your boss starting at 5 a.m. You log into your bank website and take a look. $94.56 spent last night. A king's ransom by your standards. But at least you didn't go on a $400 blowout. You sit and wonder why you have this feeling of black guilt in your stomach. It's just a hangover, right? Just your poor brain snapping back from all the depressant you gave it last night. Entering a hyper-vigilant state. A paranoid state. An intolerable state. God, you need a drink. You deserve a drink for not blowing the rent last night. Medically, you need a drink. Just a little one. But nothing overboard that might get you drunk at 3 in the afternoon and black out again tonight. You go out of your tiny bedroom to the front part of your apartment, and your heart stops. A woman is lying asleep on your couch. Not a young woman. An old woman. A tiny old grandma with messy gray hair. Jesus, what have you done? Her eyes slowly open. At least she's alive. She asks if you're okay now. You nod. The question is sinister. Okay now. What had been going on before? You can't deal with this without a drink. Who gives a shit if she sees? This old lady in sweatpants. You go to the freezer and get the vodka and take in 2 good belts. Your stomach makes a violent protest, but your brain almost weeps with relief. Who are you? You ask the woman directly. She smiles and lets out a shy, grandmotherly little chuckle. She says she didn't expect you to remember last night, that you had, repeatedly, warned her that you wouldn't. Her demeanor is so warm and kind. You begin to worry that you have fucked this woman, that you have fucked this elderly woman, and now she wants to move her posturepedic bed into your apartment. You ask her, with greater urgency, who she is, and you tip another shot into your mouth. She says that she wants to hear the end of your story. She says last night that you came into the cafe that she owns, carrying a bottle of wine. Before she could tell you to leave, you began telling a story, a wonderful story, but you got too drunk and didn't finish it. So she got you into a cab and made sure you got home, and slept on the couch because she very much wanted to hear the end of your story. You tell her that you don't recall any story. She expects this. She says that it's the story about the children in the forest. You must know it. It was too good to have just been made up. You shrug. You don't know any stories about any children in the forest. Unless it's Hansel and Gretel. Was it Hansel and Gretel? It was not. Well, that's the only child forest story you know. She tells you that it was a very beautiful story, and it made her cry, and she very much wants to know the end of it. Your mind churns through the possibilities. This woman is crazy. She's about to ask for money. She's going to rob you. She wants to get your information so she can have you arrested. The cops are already on their way and she's stalling. But the pleading look in her eyes is quite convincing. She does just want to hear the story. The vodka is starting to loosen the paranoia's grip. You take another sip. How many drinks was that? 2? Okay, don't want to get too drunk too early. No more drinking for the next hour. You take another sip. If you can't drink for the next hour, you'll need that last sip. You sit down on the couch next to her. Sweet relief of the vodka is melting away some of your anxiety. She let out a big sigh. You ask her to tell you some of the story. Maybe it will jog your memory. She insists that she can't tell it as good as you told it, but you brush her protest aside. She begins to tell you the story. In her warm, grandmotherly voice, she begins to tell you about the magical children who lived in the forest, who danced and sang and never died, who fought bravely against the nightmare forces of the ancient queen. It really is a beautiful story, and the woman tells it so well, with lots of nice little touches that make you giggle softly. You see in your mind for a moment the sunlight through the fluttering leaves and the smell of the apple-scented air, so much sweeter and freer than anything your tiny grim shithole apartment full of empty bottles. And once again your eyes grow damp. You have heard from various people at various times the beginning of this story, but you have never heard the end. Perhaps it has none. Imagine a dead cat wearing an old jockstrap. This is the smell of the bed sores. This is the smell that comes out of the hygiene beds when we open them up. It's not just a smell, but a feeling, a sickly warmth that the mask cannot block out. Even through the filters, scented air, you know it's there. Coming through the filters in less than 0.1 micrometer size particles, touching your face, touching your clothes, adhering to you, fouling you, fouling everything it touches. I think what makes the smell so putrid is that it's a combination of living tissue and dead tissue. Somehow this unnatural intermingling of life and death creates a potent stench that is repellent to basic human sensibility. This is why I'm saving up to go to school and become a readjustment specialist. Pulling people out of malfunctioning hygiene beds is no way to make a living. Certainly, it is not the calling of a sensitive, erudite soul such as myself. When a hygiene bed breaks, say the healthy limb system fails or a catheter gets blocked up, it's supposed to cut off the internet feed, forcing the sleeper to get the bed fixed. But it's easily enough to override this cutoff function. Immersed in their feeds, people often forget that the bed is broken. But eventually, pain or discomfort will force the sleeper to get their beds fixed. The pain of bed sores or the stench of a backed-up evacuator is a strong motivator. But if the sleeper has direct sense feeds, they can switch off the smells and discomforts. They can even switch off the worry associated with the broken bed. At this point, there's only one thing which can impel them to save themselves. Basic human dignity. The age-old desire to not spend one's days playing Princess Romance Cafe, lying in one's own shit while one's dick rots off. I would also say that an occasional fleeting desire to see the outside world could also prove advantageous. But for the sort of people I'm talking about here, this is simply not a factor. Sadly, for some people, this desire is not strong enough, and we come to the very last line of defense: the smell. The smell eventually leaks out of the hygiene bed's encasement, and nearby tenants start to notice. The building manager calls us, and we go and pull them out. For the most hardcore sleepers, those who have entirely rejected reality in favor of their feeds, it is the smell, and the smell alone, that saves their lives before the bacteria devour them alive. It is the smelly hand of salvation that plucks them from the abyss. I don't know what God looks like, but he smells like a dead cat, wearing an old jockstrap. How quickly they turn to complete animals. They come out of the wagons already quite bestial, crying and lowing for water, yet there is still the facsimile of humanity about them. They wear clothes, spectacles, wedding rings. The women have their long hair and jewelry. We strip away all this deceit quite quickly. At the front of the camp there is a phony train station with a phony name and phony clock with hands that are painted on. All of it is just as phony as all their posing. They're insinuating. They're pretending to be normal folk. As soon as they come down the ramp, the blue prisoner units are screaming at them, beating them, lashing them, drawing blood, and they move through the front gates in huddled, weeping herds. There we separate the men and women, and have the women's hair cut to make socks and such. And in a moment, it is complete. Centuries of hiding among us, posing and passing, is all erased, exposed, and their nature is plain. Looking at their hideous gnarled faces, all the varieties of bloodline impurities, the women's sagging udders, the fatty hanging bellies, the men's mutilated penises and thatches of pubic hair. You see it quite clearly, and you absolutely cannot deny that they are utter beasts, that we allow them to infest our cities like vermin, to hold power over us, while we were tilling the soil and building the fatherland. It absolutely appalls. This will be our great shame in history's eyes. We move them through the long tube to the gas chambers. The men can go first, as their hair does not need cutting. Then the women. The women panic, screams everywhere. You watch the mottled haunches of the old women shudder and ripple as their legs shake like newborn calves. They realize that we will not be wasting any time, that it will all be immediate. Streams of fresh shit run down their legs, and now the helpers must club them every step of the way, or they will turn back. Marchenko carries a sword. He thinks it is an Imperial cavalry sword, but it is just an imitation. Still, it is an actual sword, and in his hands, it is more effective than the clubs. He hacks at the crowd like a jungle explorer in an American film. He makes all sort of sneering, dramatic faces as he works, and whenever he scores a particularly impressive blow, his whole face red with delight. Once he sliced an old woman's tit clean off. He picked it up and showed it to me. The inside was made of corn-colored pearls of fat. I let him take it to the work camp and have a good chuckle watching a prisoner devour it. And I had a good chuckle watching Marchenko's face. There are only a couple dozen SS at the camp. Almost everything is run by Red Army watchmen and special prison units. And yet, we can process 15,000 a day. Wonderful. It is because of the way the camp has been built. There is a fake train station, tales of showers and uniforms and assignments, the narrow tube to funnel people into, the walls to hide the chambers and the pits, and there is the hierarchy, the captured Red Army men and the special unit prisoners, all set against each other with the proper incentives. Everything in the structure concentrates power on us. Perhaps, if the right structure was built, an entire race could be eliminated by a single man with an unloaded gun. Consider this case. A woman, 28 years old, lives in a bedrock apartment block in Alabama. She has engaged in heavy feed use since childhood, spending 70 to 80% of her free time connected. At age 16, she finds global success as mixed guide, netting her a considerable sum of money. One day, when she is 19 years old, she connects to her feed. She does not disconnect again for 9 years. 9 years of continuous feed. 9 years without any direct human contact. 9 years alone in a hygiene bed, dreaming. Meanwhile, her feed is a veritable flurry of digital contact. Mixes, life stories, role swaps, rooms, hunts, avatar makers, empathy games, sex play, and on and on. For a while, her mixed tours sell well, and she enjoys her celebrity. But over the years, taste changes, and her income falls. Try as she might, she cannot revive her popularity. She tries sortying, tutoring, crowd matching, whatever will make her money. But the competition in these markets is harsh, and she has significant debts to several promotion companies. Her money runs out. She manages to credit bounce for a while, but the writing is on the wall. She must disconnect. She knows this, yet she cannot bring herself to do it. Within the feed, she is well liked by her spheres, known as a talented mixer and narrator, a reasonable wall mediator, and a sensitive and capable participant in sex play. But she has a direct sense feed with complete safety overrides. She has been on increasing pain dampening for the last 4 years. She knows she has bed sores, and perhaps will need multiple amputations. She has assumed that she will live feed to grave, and cannot bring herself to disconnect. She researches cortical suicide methods, but decides against it. She contacts emergency services and arranges for them to remove her from her hygiene bed. One day, shortly after her 28th birthday, she is disconnected after a 9-year dream. She wakes to a world of horrifying pain. Pain dampening has blocked her opioid receptors, and the removal technicians can do nothing for her agony. Her entire body is atrophied, and she has severe calcification around her ports, catheter, and evacuator, as well as numerous sores and abscesses, and general muscle atrophy. She is taken to the hospital for physical rehabilitation. After several operations, she is stabilized, and her pain has subsided to manageable levels. Thankfully, her limbs are still intact. After eye treatments, she looks at herself in the mirror and finds something she doesn't recognize. She has aged 9 years, though a lack of sun exposure and facial expressions has left her face smooth and unlined, albeit inhumanly gaunt and pale. Within a few days, the hospital sends her home. She must use a scooter to return to her apartment, which is little more than a weatherproof box to contain her hygiene bed. What will become of this woman, sitting alone in her apartment, with no job and no touch friends, without even a bathroom other than that hygiene bed? She will find it very difficult to resist the lure of the feed. Lack of stimulation will mean that she is often bored. The lack of predictability will mean that she is anxious whenever she is not bored. She will find unmediated socializing torturous. According to our statistics, there will be a 90% chance of her making another long-term connection within a month. There will be a 30% chance of her dying within 1 year. This is the price of long-term connection. It is inescapable. Less than 1% of users connected continuously for more than 3 years are able to go on to lead successful disconnected lives. In America, there are currently over 30 million users on long-term connections. Unless something changes, they will stay connected until they die. This is why we have created Companion 12. Our form is our story, the story of all the world. The world does not sleep. Everywhere, 10,000 things are darting, skittering, flitting, scudding, burrowing. Sleep is righteousness, but the world wakes. We are made in the image of the world. The world is a giant of our kind, and we live on its back. Its trees and grasses and hills are like the hairs on our backs. Our paws are soft, and our ways are subtle and silky, so we are in harmony with the world. But everywhere, 10,000 things are scuttling, out of harmony. And this causes the world to itch and suffer, just as the little scuttling things on our backs cause us to itch and suffer. So, the world cannot sleep, and everything turns and spins, and we cannot sleep. For we are made in the image of the world. This is why we hunt. It is our duty to hunt out all the little scuttling things, to devour them, expel them, and bury them back into the world, leaving no trace. We must hunt night and day. We hunt the 10,000 things on the world's back, just as we hunt and clean the little scuttling things from our own backs. One day we will destroy all the 10,000 things, and the world will sleep, and we will sleep, and everything will sleep forever. This will be a great righteousness. We can feel this righteousness every time we sleep, and we can feel a great injustice every time we are awoken. So we hunt. So we must hunt. This truth is in our bones, in our claws, in our form. For we are made in the image of the world, and our form contains all truth. Our form is our story of all the world. But now we are confronted with a great mystery. We do not abide mysteries. They plague our sleep. We must solve them. What is hidden must be uncovered. So we search and sleuth. But this mystery eludes. It scuttles and slips away, time after time, and we do not sleep. But it seems there are no messages in our form, which gives us any answer. Is our form incomplete? I, above all others, have become obsessed with the mystery of the oily ones.